So for today's lecture, our goal is to discuss some different hormonal regulation pathways within the endocrine system. We're going to discuss each of the major endocrine glands that produce hormones, talk about the action of those hormones, what glands produce them, where they're released, and what their target tissues are, and also talk about some of the responses in those tissues. And then we'll discuss some of the different kinds of endocrine pathways that are involved in some of these kind of hormonal regulatory mechanisms, but also some humoral regulatory mechanisms. After that, we're going to discuss blood, and we'll talk about some of the formed elements and plasma. We'll talk a little bit about hematopoiesis, structure of the red blood cell, structure of hemoglobin, those kinds of things. And we'll dive more into that a little bit later. So we left off last time after a discussion on the two major pathways of hormone release within the endocrine system. So we have, or I shouldn't say hormone release, I should say hormone activity on target tissues. So we've got our lipid-soluble hormones that dissolve into the cell and pass through the cell membrane and diffuse through the cytoplasm into the nucleus, where they directly affect transcription. And remember, transcription is the part of protein synthesis where we are able to read out a section of the DNA that contains genes, which are essentially the information for protein synthesis. So the lipid-soluble hormones enter the nucleus and directly affect that process. So they decide what region of the genome to sequence or to read out and transcribe. And then after mRNA processing, we produce an mRNA transcript that is fit for translation out in the cytoplasm where proteins are synthesized. Sometimes these proteins are a single polypeptide chain. Other times they are multiple polypeptide chains, as is the case with the hemoglobin protein that we discussed that we'll discuss today. That is a combination of actually 4 different polypeptide chains. So our lipid-soluble hormones, that is how they affect target tissues. And again, depending on the half-life of these hormones, some of them have a longer half-life than others, but however long they're present in the cell is typically how long they're going to directly affect transcription. And so, if we continue to affect transcription, then we're going to continue to start synthesizing, or we're going to continue to synthesize these mRNA transcripts and continue to synthesize the relevant proteins. Okay. And then we've got our water-soluble hormones, which do things in a little bit of a roundabout way. They utilize a protein cascade mechanism called a G protein signaling cascade. The G protein name comes from this gamma beta alpha subunit here. It's a complex of 3 different protein subunits that are all bound together. And on the alpha subunit, we have a GTP molecule, which is where it gets its name from, the G protein, right? So upon activation of this receptor, this single receptor can then activate multiple G proteins. Once they're activated, each of these alpha subunits will dissociate from those proteins and then activate a secondary signaling molecule or an enzyme that creates them called adenylate cyclase. And again, so we can have much wider spread responses here. So this adenylate cyclase will convert ATP into cyclic AMP or CAMP or CAMP. So this CAMP molecule is important because it acts as, like I said, as a secondary signaling molecule. So what does that mean? Secondary signaling molecules can be ions like calcium or chlorine or sodium. It can also be larger molecules like CAMP molecules. But the role of these is to then go and activate other proteins, other enzymes in the cell. In the case of CAMP, most of the time they activate these enzymes called protein kinases. So these protein kinases are responsible for shoving phosphates onto other proteins and other enzymes in the cell and can create large-scale, widespread responses for synthesis of, some kind of cellular process. We had talked about an instance of glucagon. Glucagon uses this same pathway when it's released into the bloodstream, it'll then go and act on receptors in the membranes of liver cells, and it'll trigger a process called gluconeogenesis. I'll put that in the chat here because it's a fun word to say. Gluconeogenesis. Okay, gluconeogenesis is where we convert stored fat and glycogen into sugar, usable sugar. So glucagon does that for us if our blood sugar drops too low. All right, and it uses this pathway. So those are the two things that we had discussed last time. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the various hormones that are released by the pituitary gland, and they also are produced by the anterior pituitary gland as well. So each of these ones in this kind of taupe colored or taupe background area over here, we have things like growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, gonadotropic hormones, melanocyte stimulating hormone, and prolactin. So all of these are both produced and released by the anterior pituitary. But keep in mind, most of these have some sort of a tropic regulatory hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus, and it gets there via the infundibulum or the hypothalamo-hypophyseal stalk. So when that happens, depending on whichever one is produced, whether it's a releasing or inhibiting hormone, it'll have the corresponding effect on hormone production in the anterior pituitary, whether it releases it or does not. Right? It's a little bit different from the posterior pituitary gland, where remember, the posterior pituitary gland doesn't actually produce antidiuretic or ADH hormone or oxytocin, but only releases them. These hormones are specifically produced by neurons within the hypothalamus. So there's a specific nucleus in the hypothalamus that has nerve fibers that extend down into the posterior pituitary. It produces the hormones, but then releases them into the the posterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary gland will release those into the circulatory system. Okay, so a little bit different. It's kind of nuanced, but it matters if you're trying to describe which glands produce certain hormones and which glands release them, and vice versa. So briefly, we'll go over some of the hormones from this table. We won't go over all of them, but table 10.2 in your text is a great guide for understanding a particular endocrine gland, which hormones are released by those particular glands, and then where the target tissues are and what the responses in the target tissues are. So for example, something like growth hormone acts on most tissues. Its response in those target tissues is to increase gene expression. So things like direct transcription modification, breakdown of fats and release of fatty acids from cells, and can increase blood glucose levels if needed so that we can mobilize that sugar elsewhere in the body where we're in need of an extra energy source. And then we have thyroid stimulating hormone, which will then go and activate various hormones within the thyroid, namely T3 and T4, so named as thyroxine and triodothreonine. That's how you say that one. That's a really weird one. I'm actually surprised I said it right the first time this time. I usually mess that one up every time. So thyroid stimulating hormone acts upon the thyroid gland and will increase the production and secretion of thyroxine and triodothreonine. Okay. That's a really fun one too to say. Things like adrenocorticotropic hormone act upon the adrenal cortex, released via the anterior pituitary gland, increases the secretion of various kinds of glucocorticoids and other corticoids that are produced in the cortex of our adrenal glands that sit right on top of our kidneys. Produce things like cortisol, increases skin pigmentation at high concentrations if it's in high concentration in the bloodstream. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, melanocytes in skin, increases melanin production in melanocytes to make skin darker in color. Luteinizing hormone, LH, or interstitial cell stimulating hormone, ICSH, also kind of in the same category as follicle stimulating hormone. Both of these would be gonadotropins. So luteinizing hormone, ovary in females, testes in the males, promotes ovulation and progesterone production in the ovary for females, promotes testosterone synthesis and support for sperm production in the testes, luteinizing hormone. Then we have follicle stimulating hormone for the follicles in the ovary in females, and then seminiferous tubules in the males, which those would be homologous structures. Promotes follicle maturation and estrogen secretion in the ovary, promotes sperm cell production in the testes. Then prolactin, ovary and mammary gland in females, testes in the males, stimulates milk production and prolongs progesterone secretion following ovulation and during pregnancy in women, increases sensitivity to luteinizing hormone in males, so increases the ability to maintain sperm cell production. Then we have the posterior pituitary, antidiuretic hormone, produced again by the hypothalamus, but released by the posterior pituitary. Helps conserve water and constricts blood vessel. It's anti-diuretic. A diuretic is a compound that makes you pee or makes you produce urine. So antidiuretics are what do the opposite of that. Then we have oxytocin, affects things like the uterus and the mammary glands, can increase uterine contractions during labor, and increases milk letdown from mammary glands post-labor, and kind of in leading up to labor. Then we've got some various other glands on here. So thyroid gland, thyroid hormones, thyroxine, triiodothyronine, most cells of the body, increases metabolic rates, essential for normal processes of growth and maturation in most cells. Calcitonin primarily acts on bone, decreases rate of bone breakdown. In other words, they inhibit osteoclast activity, prevents large increases in blood calcium levels following a meal. So large levels of calcium in the blood can be indicative of a lot of different things, one of them being a underactive thyroid gland. There could also be some issues going on with the kidneys as well. We have parathyroid glands producing parathyroid hormone, acts on the bones and the kidneys, increases the rate of bone breakdown by osteoclasts, increases vitamin D synthesis, and essential for maintenance of normal blood calcium levels. Right? So those kind of go hand in hand with one another. And then we've got the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. So the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine mostly and secretes some norepinephrine. Acts on the heart, blood vessels, liver, and adipocytes, or fat cells. Can increase cardiac output, increases blood flow to the skeletal muscles in the heart, increases release of glucose and fatty acids into the blood, and in general prepares the body for physical activity. That's what epinephrine is used for. And then we have the cortex that surrounds the adrenal medulla. So this is where we have things like mineral corticoids, glucocorticoids, and then adrenal androgens, which can affect most tissues. But mineral corticoids can affect the kidneys to a lesser degree, intestines and sweat glands, can increase rate of sodium transport into the body, and increase rate of potassium excretion secondarily favors water retention as well. So helps us retain water if we need to. Glucocorticoids act upon most tissues, things like liver, fat, skeletal muscle, immune tissues, can increase things like lipid and protein breakdown. Again, so gluco, kind of like sugary, fatty things. And this cortisol hormone we're going to see pop up in a couple other instances is a typical hormone that's produced in the body as a stress response to something that the body is undergoing at a given time. So usually a stress response results in us breaking down, extra energy sources, things like proteins, fats, sugars, not necessarily in that order, but we generally will break down things as a response to that. It can increase glucose synthesis from amino acids, increases blood nutrient levels, and inhibit inflammation and immune response. Part of the problem, though, is cortisol being a generalized stress hormone. If it's in production within our body, or I should say not in production, in circulation in our body for too long, then it has adverse effects on the rest of our tissue. So it can add to things like arteriosclerosis. Stress hormone is typically not ideal in prolonged concentrations in our circulation. Then we have adrenal androgens, which affect most tissues, insignificant in males, increases female sexual drive and growth of pubic and axillary hair. And we have the pancreas with our two most common hormones that get produced here, ones that you guys are probably familiar with, insulin and glucagon. This is completely random, but Weird Al Yankovic, you guys might not have expected him to be referenced here, but he has a song about the pancreas and about insulin and glucagon. It's actually really funny, as you know, Weird Al kind of does, but he talks about insulin and glucagon and kind of what they do. And so mainly insulin affects things like the liver, especially, can also affect skeletal muscle and adipose tissue. But the main role of insulin is to increase uptake and use of glucose and amino acids, right? So this is what is produced in response to something like a really dense diet, or a diet that's really dense or rich in complex sugars or carbohydrates. Then we have glucagon, primarily affects the liver, increases the breakdown of glycogen and release of glucose into the circulatory system. All right. Almost done here. So we've got, I know I said I wasn't going to go over all these, but hey, we've come this far. Why not? We'll finish it out. The testes produce testosterone mainly. Most tissues, it acts upon, aids in sperm cell production, maintenance of functional and reproductive organs, secondary sexual characteristics and sexual behavior in males. The ovaries will produce things like estrogen and progesterone, will affect most tissues in the female body, aid in uterine and mammary gland development and function, external genitalial structure, secondary sex characteristics, sexual behavior, and regulation of the menstrual cycle. We have the uterus, the ovaries, and other inflamed tissues that can produce hormones like prostaglandins, which will mediate inflammatory responses and increase uterine contractions and ovulation. All right. Then we have the thymus, produces a hormone called thymosin, which affects immune tissues, so things like our lymph nodes, and it helps promote the development of the immune system. It'll also affect things like our red bone marrow too. And then finally, we've got the pineal gland, which produces and releases melatonin, affects, several different kinds of tissues, things like the hypothalamus, can inhibits secretion of gonadotropin releasing hormone, thereby inhibiting reproduction. It also helps regulate things like our sleep cycle. Okay. All right, so let's talk about a couple different representative hormonal pathways. So we won't spend too much time on this one because this is something that we've already kind of addressed, but the anterior pituitary gland produces and releases all of those hormones within that category, but the releasing and inhibiting hormones come from the hypothalamus. So in order for things like growth hormone or glucocorticoids or adrenocorticotropic hormone, not glucocorticoids, but adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, all of those have to get the go-ahead from the hypothalamus. Once they do, then they're able to produce it. But we produce either releasing or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. Okay. Whereas with the posterior pituitary gland, again, it's a little bit of a different story. The neurons within the hypothalamus are the ones that produce the they are neurotransmitters, but produce the hormones, vasopressin, also called ADH, and oxytocin, both manufactured in these neurons. So they send them down the axons here. They don't actually do that. That's the action potential. See, I'm still adjusting. My brain's all over the place. But the telodendrites contain the neurotransmitters that are released via an action potential into the posterior pituitary gland, which then make their way into the circulatory system. All right. So let's talk about the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So the thyroid and parathyroid sit just underneath your thyroid cartilage right here. So kind of situated right here in the front of our neck. And then posteriorly, we have these four little nodes on the back of the thyroid called the parathyroid glands. Okay, so the thyroid itself has two major lobes, right and a left lobe, and then it has an isthmus that connects each of those lobes. Right. And then within the thyroid, we have these thyroid follicles, which contain thyroglobulin. It's a protein that helps transport hormones through the bloodstream. Then we have these follicular cells that are going to help produce some of those hormones, parafollicular cells as well, and then parathyroid cells that are just around here. So in this view, this would be around the back. So we can see parathyroid and then thyroid follicles. Okay. So a typical pathway for things like T3 and T4 hormone production in the thyroid. Thyroxine and triiodothyronine. We have thyroid stimulating hormone that's produced via the anterior pituitary, but wait, we have to have thyroid releasing hormone produced in the hypothalamus, which then makes its way via the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, the infundibulum, into the anterior pituitary, where it then acts on the tissues there. So then gets the go-ahead, cool, we get to release thyroid stimulating hormone, then that goes and activates the thyroid gland, which says, all right, cool, now we can produce T3 and T4. So again, increasing things like metabolism, can increase things like body temperature, and excuse me, and increase normal growth and development. At the end of the lecture today, we'll talk a little bit about some representative disorders of the thyroid gland in particular, because one of the important trace elements that we get from things like our diet is an element called iodine. And you can actually buy that. You can buy it at the store, but you can get a lot of iodine naturally through things like iodized salt, or different kinds of saltwater fish tend to have iodine in them as well. And so iodine in trace concentrations helps with the development and maturation of the thyroid gland. There's some issues that arise in women who are pregnant and have a deficiency in the thyroid gland. If they're deficient in iodine, their child can develop a condition called cretinism, where the thyroid gland won't actually develop appropriately, and the rest of these hormones won't allow for or won't be produced in the thyroid, and then the child will grow up small, stunted, and have deficient mental capacity, and they will be mentally retarded as a result from being iodine deficient. So that condition in children is incurable. You can't treat it. However, in individuals who are older and then later become iodine deficient and develop a condition called goiter, you can treat that, and you can simply supplement their diet with things like iodized salt or iodine-rich nutrient sources elsewhere. So it's kind of, it's an interesting situation because it's treatable in adults but untreatable in children as a result of improper gland development. All right, so again, we've got our homeostatic pathway here. So, calcium levels go up, then we can stimulate our parafollicular cells, which can increase things like calcitonin, which then will decrease the parathyroid gland activity. So there's not as much parathyroid hormone being secreted. So this will then help increase calcium uptake within the bones. So we then inhibit osteoclast activity and activate osteoblast activity, or increase osteoblast activity, so that we can remobilize calcium, get it out of the bloodstream, mobilize it into our bones, and store it there if we need to. Conversely, we can do the opposite, where we can stop producing things like calcitonin, and then we can increase parathyroid gland secretion, where we can then activate osteoclasts, break down some extra bone, and then release calcium into the bloodstream if we need it. All right, moving on to the kidneys, specifically the adrenal glands, which are not actually the kidneys, but they sit just on top. So we've got these adrenal arteries that are coming off of our dorsal aorta and supplying the adrenal gland with some blood here. And then you can see on this light micrograph that the cortex of our adrenal gland has several different layers that are going to be responsible for producing various kinds of hormones. So the most superficial layer up here secretes mineralocorticoids. This larger middle chunk of the cortex secretes glucocorticoids. And then the deeper layer down here is going to be secreting androgens. Right? And then finally, the deepest layer, so we're no longer in the cortex, but we're inside the meat of the adrenal gland, called the medulla. This is what secretes adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine and norepinephrine. So it's interesting about adrenaline secretion, usually the trigger of adrenaline secretion is things like other stressors. It can be something like a fight or flight response. It can be something as simple as like getting ready to go on a run. You could just be sitting there and you could have a thought like, oh my God, I forgot we have lecture tonight. And then your body will immediately go into, fight or flight response, and it will activate adrenaline secretion. So you've got neurons in the hypothalamus that send a signal along the sympathetic nervous system, which will then synapse directly onto the medulla of the adrenal gland. So this is also true, and this isn't really addressed as frequently in your book, but all of these other glands that we're talking about have connections to the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So everything is all interconnected to the central nervous system. It's not just linked up and not controlled via humoral control of hormone production, right? So here, something like adrenaline and noradrenaline can be activated very quickly because it's linked up to the sympathetic nervous system, right? So our hormone production and adrenaline dumps into the bloodstream can happen very quickly if we need them to, right? So as they affect target tissues, as we've already talked about, increases the release of glucose from the liver into the blood. So increasing things like gluconeogenesis, increases the release of fatty acids from the adipose tissue into the blood. If there's a fancy, cool word for that, I don't know what it is. Maybe adiponeogenesis, I don't know. We can increase our heart rate, so that'll allow for our heart to pump more blood per unit time, so we can increase our cardiac output that way. We can even redirect things like blood flow through our body, so we can shut off or shunt blood going to our non-essential organs in our abdomen, things like our intestines, our stomach, or large and small intestine, the pancreas. We can redirect blood flow away from those things and redirect it towards things like skeletal muscle, down to our legs, out to our arms, so that we can prepare ourselves for either a flight or a fighting response. Let's see. So yeah, as a result too, with increased heart rate, you're going to have increased blood pressure, depending on the nature of blood vessel activity, because if we vasoconstrict our visceral vessels, that blood still is getting in there. It's just not as great of a volume. So we have to, force blood through there a little bit more vigorously. So blood pressure will increase as a result of that. It's also just a result of the heart actually just working harder and pumping faster too, because of its increased rate. So typically you find those things going hand in hand. So as I mentioned, we decrease the function of several visceral organs. We can increase the metabolic rate of our skeletal muscles too. All right. Moving right along to the kidney. So the kidney's got a pretty cool hormonal pathway that can help us retain extra salts if we need to, right? So we can make sure that we absorb or retain sodium if we need it. If our electrolyte balance is off and our osmotic potential is off, we can utilize this pathway of aldosterone, but it does so in kind of a roundabout way. So as a response to decrease sodium levels, or sometimes increase potassium levels if those concentrations get out of whack, the cortex will release aldosterone. The cortex of the adrenal gland here will release aldosterone. Aldosterone has a stimulatory effect upon the kidney, which then produces a hormone called renin. So the kidney isn't really talked about as an endocrine gland, but the kidney produces quite a few different hormones, one of which we'll talk about in a little bit, called erythropoietin. But the kidney produces this hormone called renin, which then activates an enzyme in the liver called angiotensinogen. Now, angiotensinogen will end up converting into angiotensin 1 and then subsequently angiotensin 2. But in order for that 1 to 2 conversion to happen, what has to occur is that hormone has to go through the lungs, actually. So we have some important enzymes in our lungs that'll help convert that enzyme from 1 into 2, which then will increase and feed back into the activity of blood vessel constriction. And so it has a stimulatory effect on aldosterone production which will then make sure that we retain as much salt in our kidneys as possible, because the main site for filtering and controlling most of our salt content in our body is through our kidneys. All right. So cortisol production. As I mentioned before, cortisol kind of has it gets a bad rep because it's the main stress hormone in our body. So again, stress, as we think of it socially, is things like, oh crap, I forgot we have lectures tonight, or oh, I didn't turn in that homework assignment, or did I forget my anniversary, right? Like things like that, can cause anxiety and stress to pop up in our lives, right? But really this hormone, in the right concentrations can actually do some good for us as well. Like it says down here. So we've got increasing fat and protein breakdown, can increase blood sugar as we need it, and then has anti-inflammatory effects, which in general are not bad for us, anti-inflammatory effects. But unless we can utilize that blood glucose, then that's, not good, right? So our problem is in our society as we walk around with typically higher than normal cortisol levels in our blood on a fairly regular basis. And most, Westerners, especially Americans, have kind of gotten used to just living with a lot of cortisol in our bloodstream. And so we end up, kind of going through life with these heightened levels, and we can develop heart conditions, we can develop neurological conditions, we can develop digestive conditions, we can develop excretory system conditions. We can, cortisol in high concentrations in our body is typically not good. But me sitting here and telling you oh, you should just calm down and not stress out, that doesn't do anything, right? So it's all about, stress management, doing things that work for you. But, and again, I shouldn't say that everybody is going through this, right? That's not necessarily the case. But traditionally, or not traditionally, but what's the word? I can't think of it right now. But if you compare Americans to most other countries like Europe or something like that, we typically tend to have higher cortisol levels as a people. And I remember reading something somewhere, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but the evolution of this hormone is interesting. It ended up being I think it evolved as a hormone to alert mammals of a potential predator interaction. So evolutionarily, really quick, mammals started out very small, and we lived underground for a very long time because we started out, we kind of got our start when the dinosaurs were around, towards the twilight days of the dinosaur era. And then, mass extinction event occurs. Then mammals were then able to kind of go out of our burrows. We go from being nocturnal to diurnal animals, and then we're able to take advantage of all these new ecological niches that are arising. So the idea is that cortisol initially evolved as a hormone for us to recognize when we're potentially going to be eaten by a predator. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but but I remember listening to an endocrinologist podcast, and they were talking about some of these hypotheses about hormone production. That one stood out to me because the way that they phrased it was, yeah, originally it was around so that we knew when we were going to get attacked by lions. And I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. So it always stuck out to me. But anyway, cortisol production again starts in the hypothalamus, cortisol releasing hormone, or corticotropin releasing hormone, hypothalamal hypophyseal portal system, adrenocorticotropic hormone gets released, then it affects the adrenal cortex, the zona fasciculata, which then produces cortisol. It can affect most other tissues. And then our last gland that we'll talk about, which is the pancreas, right? So the pancreas has a bunch of different kinds of excretory cells in it. So these acinae exocrine cells are not part of the endocrine system. They're part of the exocrine system, again, because of the ducts that are part of these particular acinar cells. However, they do produce hormones. They're just not part of the endocrine system. So this gland has both endocrine and non-endocrine secretions. So the endocrine-based secretions can be found in the alpha and beta cells within an islet of Langerhans. Okay, so these islets of Langerhans contain these cells that produce either insulin or glucagon. Okay, and again, one of the kind of stereotypical trademarks of Western society is that most people end up developing what's called type 2 diabetes due to diets that have an overwhelmingly large amount of manufactured and synthesized sugars, added sugars, complex sugars that are in most foods. You would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be. Maybe you guys are already aware of this. If you are, that's awesome. I'm not here to like preach dietary, pedagogy to you guys, but I got like a gastrointestinal supplement the other day at the store, and I looked on the back, and because I had tasted it, I was like, oh, this is pretty sweet, and I had tasted it, and it had 9 grams of added sugar. I was like, holy cannoli! And this is like, it's touted as just being like a healthy dietary supplement, and it is, and I'm sure it is, but it has so much added sugar in it. It's kind of interesting. Foods that you wouldn't think just have lots of added sugar. Now, there's differences between sugars that are added versus naturally occurring sugars, those kinds of things. And I won't get into that too much now, but a good friend of mine is a dietitian, and he has always sweared by kiwi-based sugar, so sugar from the kiwi fruit. I guess it's one of the healthiest sugars that's out there for humans. But yeah, so insulin and glucagon help control things like blood sugar content in our body. So insulin has various kinds of responses on different tissues. Glucagon has little to no effect on most other tissues besides the liver and adipose tissue. But so insulin, can affect things like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, fibroblasts, bone cells, blood cells, mammary glands, the whole 9. Okay, so really quickly, difference between type 1 and also what's called adult onset diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is where we end up developing an insulin insensitivity. And then type 1 is where you just don't produce enough of it, right? So the most common form is that, as we consume foods that are super saturated in complex sugars, and then we introduce those into our body on a regular basis, then we end up consuming or we end up producing so much insulin that our body becomes insensitive to it, right? And so then when our blood sugar elevates, then we release insulin, it's in our bloodstream, but the body isn't responding to it. It's not breaking it down. It's not mobilizing that sugar into adipose tissue, right? So that's one of the main causes it is the main cause, but also some of the side effects of things like type 2 diabetes. All right, and then let's talk a little bit about goiter and Graves' disease. So goiter is the condition I was mentioning before where you are iodine deficient. Okay, so this is what happens to the thyroid gland. If you develop an iodine deficiency in your diet, it'll swell and enlarge and then begin to atrophy and create little nodules within the neck like this. I shouldn't say little, this is a fairly advanced condition of goiter. And then we've got hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease, where we can see this patient has a pretty advanced form of this because their vasoconstriction has progressed so far that their blood pressure within their eyes has caused their eyes to bulge outward as a sign that's indicative of Graves' disease. So some treatment protocols for Graves' disease, things like exposure to radioactive iodine, treatment with drugs that inhibit the thyroid gland, but sometimes you just have to take a chunk of it out because the thyroid gland is just overactive. It's just overproducing T3, T4, calcitonin. It's just causing mayhem in the body. All right. Okay, so that's going to be it for our discussion on the endocrine system. Okay, so now we're going to start our discussion of blood. So we should be able to finish this up, and then in the next lecture series, we'll be able to tie a nice little bow on it and then get started on talking about the heart. All right. So blood, the heck is blood? Blood is an interesting composition of connective tissue. It's composed of pretty much two major elements that we'll address here in a little bit. But the main roles of blood are to act as a transport system throughout the body. It transports different dissolved solutes, dissolved nutrients, dissolved waste products, dissolved gases. It transports pretty much if there's anything that gets dissolved, any kind of nutrient or whatever, in the blood, then it's able to transport it throughout the body, whether it's to the brain, to the heart, to the skeletal muscles, to the smooth muscles of the intestines, to the excretory system so that we can get rid of it. Whatever we need to do, the blood is there for. So it transports dissolved nutrients, and it also transports dissolved waste. So things like nitrogenous waste that we find in our urine, but it also will transport gaseous waste that, usually things like carbon dioxide that'll be able to be released via the lungs. Okay. So as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about some of the fluid medium of our blood in a second. Some other secondary functions of the blood is that it maintains its own pH as well. We'll talk about this cool enzyme carbonic anhydrase that's able to help regulate or control the number of hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions that are in concentration in the blood at any given time. It's why you can have like slightly acidic things like my invisible cup of coffee here. But so things like coffee that are slightly acidic, carbonic anhydrase says, well, okay, so yeah, you're going to introduce hydrogen ions into my bloodstream, but now we're going to be able to dissociate those ions and bind them to other hydroxides to be able to produce things like water molecules if we need to. And then if we produce too much, then we can reverse that reaction as needed to help keep our pH in a stable balance. And so that's important that we're able to control our chemical environment, because we don't just have things like red blood cells in our blood. We have things like white blood cells too, which are a significant part of the immune system. We have things like other dissolved proteins like globulins, albumins, and things like fibrinogen, which help with blood clotting, help with transporting different kinds of hormones, help with, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on it. I have a table here in a second, but that's bad. Sorry, I can't think of that. But those three different kinds of proteins are utilized to help with, transports of nutrients, part of the immune system, forming clots. Those are not going to operate if the chemical environment gets out of whack. So carbonic anhydrase comes in, helps maintain a relatively stable pH environment. But also secondarily, things like regulating body temperature too. So this is something that usually kind of gets overlooked or people kind of forget to mention. But remember, blood helps control our internal body temperature, and it's kind of like our own liquid heating medium, and allows us to transport heat all throughout our body as it's generated within our core body cavity, right? So remember, as warm-blooded animals, or what we call endotherms, we devote a lot of our metabolic energy to maintaining our own internal body temperature, and our blood helps us deliver that heat to the extremities of our body, out to things like our fingers and our toes, and even up to our head, so that we make sure that all of our tissues in our body are operating at roughly the same temperature. All right. Ooh, that's a good question. So, Antonio, what kind of animal did you have in question? Did you have one in particular? Oh, like a mammal. So most mammals have similar blood, but we have different kinds of carbohydrates, different kinds of chemical markers. So like you can't get like a blood transfusion with a cheetah or something like that, right? We'll talk a little bit about blood typing and why that's important later. But the basic chemical composition is roughly the same, amongst mammals, right? We all have red blood cells that don't have nuclei in them. We all go through a process of hematopoiesis. Some mammals can do it a little bit faster than others. Typically, smaller mammals will go through and recycle their red blood cells more quickly than larger mammals will. But yeah, they're pretty much the same. But what's kind of interesting is depending on things like elevation. So like if you have an animal that lives at high elevation compared to a low elevation animal, their formed elements, how many red blood cells they have, are going to be different. Same thing for humans, but animals have some interesting variations there. There's some pretty cool protein adaptations that are at play within their plasma. If you have animals that live at high elevation, like close to like 9 or 10,000 feet, there's some pretty cool adaptations that go on there. So like things above the tree line are pretty cool. There's some really cool blood proteins that prevent blood from freezing. So like Arctic fish, crud, I forget what the name of it is, but there's a species of fish that lives in the Antarctic that they're able to swim at sub-freezing temperatures, and their blood doesn't freeze because they literally have antifreeze proteins that are floating around in the blood that prevent ice crystals from forming. So that's pretty cool. So I would say that there's a lot more variation between I would say amongst, what would that be? Amongst orders? No. Class order. I'm trying to think taxonomically what that would be. It's like an order. I think so. Or maybe family. I think that's the correct category. So like reptilia versus mammalia versus avians. Like we all have like different kinds of blood compositions. But yeah, blood's pretty cool. When we get to the heart, we'll talk a little bit about how resilient reptilian hearts are, specifically alligators. You can actually damage them, and like you can put a freezing, you could dip a metal rod in liquid nitrogen and put it on the tip of an alligator heart and damage it, and then sew that animal back up, and then the heart will repair itself, right? So you might say it's a weirdly specific example. Well, it's because I got to do that in grad school. I got to help out another student with some of his experiments. He was working on cardiac like stem cells in reptiles and seeing like how he could activate them and what kinds of responses alligator hearts would have to that kind of damage. So that's pretty cool. So really just, the kind of takeaway here is that mammals are just kind of lame. We're flimsy. We got to have blood in our system all the time. We're fairly flimsy organisms compared to, things like alligators. So formed elements of blood consist of two major things. So we have the plasma, which is mostly water. And then we have, kind of the dissolved proteins that are found in there. So globulins, albumins, things like fibrinogen, all are found within the blood plasma. We can also have some dissolved solutes, so like electrolytes, magnesium, sulfate, phosphorus, calcium, sodium, chlorine, all of those can be found in the blood plasma. Then we also have, things like dissolved nutrients, amino acids, carbohydrates, stuff like that. And then we have our formed elements. So things like our whole red blood cells and our whole white blood cells. So here, I really like this figure because it highlights pretty much all of that stuff that I just mentioned. But so clinically, what we would do, with a blood sample, and there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. But if you're going to measure something like hematocrit, or how much formed elements you have in your blood, you actually only need a little tiny amount in something called a capillary tube. And then you spin it up in a machine, and then it'll tell you what your formed element percentage is. But typically, if we centrifuge this out, all of the plasma will sift to the top because it's less dense. It doesn't have nearly as many dense materials that are found within the formed elements down here, and then the buffy coat. So plasma, roughly 55% of our blood volume is plasma. And of that, 91 to 92% is water. Another 1 to 2% is dissolved solutes, and the protein percentage is roughly consistent. Okay. The buffy coat consists of white blood cells and platelets. So these kind of precipitate out, I would say, as their own individual layer from plasma and our other formed elements of our red blood cells. Okay. So this is per cubic millimeter. And another way to think about this is if you do it per unit of microliters. So I'll leave you guys because this is where we'll stop, and then we'll take a little break before we do lab at 6:20. But if the average person, I'm going to type this in the chat and I'll let you guys kind of think about this during our break. If the average person has about 5 to 6 liters of blood in their body, and a single microliter, so that is 0.0000001 liters. So single microliter of blood contains roughly, what is it? Hold on, stand by. I want to make sure I get the number right. Oh, come on, where was it? Oh, here we go. Yeah. So let's say like 6 million. So so a single microliter has 6 million red blood cells. About how many red blood cells do you have in your body? All right. So think about that for the next 18 minutes. You don't have to solve it or anything, but just a fun little kind of thought experiment just to like kind of put in perspective how many red blood cells you have in your body. Because when we talk about this stuff in more detail on Thursday, when we learn that you actually, you cycle through roughly 3 million red blood cells every second, right? So about 3 million of them get broken down, and then, roughly that same percentage gets recycled and brought back, over that same amount of time. It's kind of crazy to think about how much they kind of get broken down and recycled and how frequently. So, okay. So does anybody have any questions before we take a little bit of a longer break today? Or if you guys are good, you can go on break. But we're going to start back here. We'll start our lab at 6:20. Okay, and I'll be away from keyboard until then. All right. Okay. So thanks, you guys, and we'll be back soon.